Hey everyone, what's good? It's me, Lex, back at you with another Starfinder 2nd Edition playtest video. Today I'm going to be going over my initial impressions of the playtest as a whole, my first thoughts, some of my deeper thoughts as I've done a lot of testing in private and I've run a few sessions, and I've been playing around with some of the various options in various modes of play. I have a little list here that I typed out in Paint that's going to be kind of guiding what I talk about. I'm going to be leading off with doing some class covering content first, because I think that's what's going to be the most interesting to the most amount of people, and it's going to provide a very good springboard, I think, for launching into other discussions further on and kind of deeper into the game. So, we're going to begin with the Envoy. The Envoy is the charisma-based 8-hit point marshal of the Starfinder playtest. They have some particular skill proficiency, and they have a unique take on the rogue's additional skill feats, where rather than gaining additional skill feats at all, or like at every level, I should say, they have an ability called Adaptive Talent that gives them a set of skill feats that they meet the prerequisites for every day at daily preparations, that they can switch out and use to qualify for further adaptive talent feats. The Envoy as well, in combat, focuses on using directives, kind of leading their team to give them bonuses, and then if they take the actions that they're commanding their team to do, then their team and they get even greater bonuses. So the basic one that all envoys get is Get 'em. You select a creature within 60 feet, the creature gets a penalty to AC and reflex saves, and then if you strike them, you get a damage bonus, and the rest of your team gets a damage bonus for the rest of the game. Or, not the rest of the game, the rest of the round. There we go. Specifically, what I wanted to hone in on with Envoy is talking first about the new skill format that they're experimenting with here. I think it's very, very interesting. I like it quite a lot. I'm looking forward to seeing some more of it in play, as I have not gotten the greatest amount of experience with seeing what it can offer. But I think that it's an amazing framework for someone who's adaptable on the go. They have all the skill trainings, so they can continue to use trained actions and spend their skill feats on things they're dedicated good at, but then being able to switch it out with your adaptive talent is very, very functional. Their size up feature, I think, is solid enough. It isn't the most impactful thing, but it's a very flavorful thing. But the main thing that I really wanted to focus on too with Envoy, and something that I have noticed in playtesting thus far, is that the Get 'em directory, adding flat damage to your attacks and your teammates' attacks, just adds an immense amount to game feel, and also to be fair, the balance. If you have 4 people, and even 3 of them have guns, let's say, and everyone's shooting at the enemy that you used your directive on, everyone's getting an AC bonus, and between everyone, there's going to be a very sizable amount of damage, especially as you scale up into the higher levels, being added to your team as a whole. And I just think that the amount of flat damage that is being added with Get 'em is something that not necessarily I'd want to see on all weapons, but I would like to see more ways to add bonus damage to everyone's weapons at range, to kind of give ranged characters the ability to not have those bad rolls where they roll just a whole sequence of ones and they do very, very little damage, particularly now that the firearms do not have the fatal trait across the board, more or less. The biggest issue that we're running into with game feel is that damage numbers are very variable, and that is a product of how range functions currently. I'm not exactly sure how I'd like to see this implemented, and I'm not saying in specific that I want everyone to have some variation of aim or get 'em or anything like that. But it's something to consider, some way to mitigate firearms not feeling as potent, which has been done in part thus far by the team by just opening up how often you can use firearms, allowing things like the area fire action, not having to reload. It makes these actions feel a lot more free, which then means that when it is a poor roll, for example, it doesn't feel punishing so much as it feels like you didn't do super great. So I don't even necessarily think this is something that needs to be fixed. It's just maybe something to think about a little bit. Moving on to Mystic. This is the 8 hit point Wisdom caster, focused on having a connection with their teammates that allows them to heal them as a single action for small amounts consistently through combat, with a few different subclasses that can give them access to various benefits when they do so, and some focus spells that are very defining. Mystic is kind of an example of something that I'm going to talk about later in the overall infrastructure section, but I wanted to touch on here because I think Mystic is a perfect example of the Starfinder team has not been entirely clear in their communications thus far about whether they want the systems to be compatible or balanced against one another. They have descriptions, like in the front matter of this book, saying things like they expect to see a Witchwarper right next to a fighter or a wizard. But then we have some examples of them saying that it's more so that they want the systems to be compatible and not necessarily the classes to stand side by side and be outputting in the same niches. Now, I want to set the record straight here before I get too far into the video, because I know that a fair amount of people will probably not make it all the way to the end to hear me clarify this. I do not think that the Starfinder classes are overpowered or overshadow Pathfinder 2nd edition classes. I think that rather than that, the Starfinder team has done very, very well at ensuring that they represent their own niches, completely unique and separate to the Pathfinder classes, and compete in those niches more effectively than the Pathfinder classes will. But then will, of course, perform worse in the niches that the Pathfinder classes have carved out. And so that's why I hone in on Mystic here, for example. Something that was very concerning in, of course, White Room testing and ideas with the Mystic was the connection, the ability to heal just damage over and over again. It seems very strong, especially with that long-range connection. And then particularly if you get into their healing connection, where your initial focus spell, the infusion focus spell, is just heal, except it's d6s and a flat 6 instead of d8s and a flat 8. There were some concerns, at least among myself and the people that I speak to, that this would be too strong, that it would kind of outshine some of the other healing options were they to be put into the same system. But this has not been my experience at all. Instead, Mystic has kind of provided a unique, consistent, reliable healing source, but kind of struggles to output the burst healing and sustainability that something like a wood kineticist or, for example, a cleric would be able to maintain. And so it manages to very, very well tread that line where it is balanced with Pathfinder and compatible with it. And again, I'll get into that later. Next up is Operative. Operative is a class that has been having a lot of discussion had about it recently, at least that I've seen in all sorts of forums, Discord, etc. It is a dexterity key attribute, kind of just frontline damage dealing class. It has expertise with weaponry, an aim action that lets it mitigate some cover and do additional damage, and then a bunch of subclasses that allow you to specialize in certain methods of dealing damage. Now, something that I've seen a particular amount of focus on is a specific feat that they have called Hair Trigger at level 2. This allows them to, as a reaction, attack of opportunity something within their first range increment. But the thing that I've been finding in play and in various experiments that I've ran as well is that Operative is very much so balanced for the game that it's in, and that's another kind of aspect of balance versus compatibility. I'll touch on that more later again, but in the system of Starfinder 2nd Edition, I do not think that the Operative is too strong of a class. I think, if anything, the biggest issue that it has is that a lot of its benefits seem to be kind of dependent on your build, even though they're granted to everyone. So, for example, Tactical Barrage, granting you Agile Grace with all of your weapons, is not useful if you are a sniper operative. So that's something to keep in mind. Something that I've been thinking about and considering is if they were to take some of the base features that the Operative gets and bake them instead into the specializations. So, for example, maybe the Skirmisher would get the movement speed bonus that the Operative gets. Something like the Sniper could get the reload on movement. The Striker could also get speed and maybe Agile Grace, etc. It's a whole thing to think about and consider, but generally, I think what I've found is that Operative is a balanced class within the ecosystem of the game that it is settled in, and that's very, very fun to see. Particularly with Hair Trigger, I want to address this because I know it's something that is on a lot of people's minds, is it does not function with any of the firearms that are capable of outputting massive damage. The sniper rifle is the only gun with the fatal trait, and that also has the unwieldy trait, which means it cannot be used to make strikes as part of a reaction. So it can't be used to unleash devastating damage off of your turn, and instead it's going to be something more like the standard rifles or even a pistol, and at that point you are not doing high enough damage for it to be an issue because you don't have those flat modifiers, nor do you have the immense damage traits of something like fatal, and so it ends up, in my experience thus far at least, being a very balanced alternative in a meta that is going to be seemingly much more mobile and much more high range and include a lot of cover, and particularly because Operative also can't take advantage of their aim action to bypass that cover and do extra damage while it's not their turn. It means that Hair Trigger is fine. Moving on though to Solarian. Solarian is a very, very interesting class. They're kind of a melee-focused 10 hit point con key class that focuses on manifesting solar weaponry. They kind of go back and forth between like stars and black holes and using those powers, as you can see by their little icon here. And they focus a lot on strength abilities. There are a few things that I want to touch on here. Specifically, the solar weapon, and this is something more that I want to get into when I get into the Dex Meta concerns at the bottom of the class specifics, but the Solarian has the ability to manifest their own solar weapons, just choose all of the traits on them. I think that this is something that is immensely interesting and something that I couldn't even see happening in Pathfinder, at least to this extent. I think it's something that being in a ranged meta has opened up, is the ability to use these weapons and these traits much more freely. And that's something that I really like to see. But the biggest issue that I'm finding with Solarian is this kind of difficulty with having strength as a key statistic, and having really short range, and then some various wording issues. For example, Solar Shot here is a ranged strike against the AC of a creature in range. It adds your strength modifier to the damage roll. But what this implies to me is that it's a dexterity attack, even though you should be building into strength to utilize your melee weapons. Foundry, the virtual tabletop, has automated it as a strength attack. It also does not benefit from the crystals that Solarians can imbue themselves with to improve the potency of their solar manifestations, which is another concern that I have, but those are simple things that can, of course, be touched up as time goes on. But generally, what I've found is that Solarian is very capable of getting up onto the front line, maintaining aggro, dealing damage, controlling area, but it's more so a case of it feels, I guess I would say, less interesting when there aren't as many people in melee. Part of what makes the melee meta in Pathfinder so fun is that everyone's running around in melee, and you get to set up flanking, aid each other, team up with each other, etc., use repositions and shoves and trips and grapples in combination with one another in melee combat. Whereas in Starfinder, if you're the Solarian, it is reasonably likely that you are going to be the only person in melee combat. You're going to be dashing ahead of your team while they pull up behind you with the guns. And while that's not quite an issue, I would like to see some more support for that playstyle, and kind of ways to make it more interesting as a solo martial on the front line, or a solo melee player on the front line. That's the big thing that's on my mind with Solarian thus far. I think as far as their balance goes, they have some very rough progression. They have, if I'll pull this up here, they have a very strange progression on their, here we go, on their class DC, being the worst in the entire playtest except for Mystic. Their class DC does not hit Expert until level 13, and then it's very interesting for a class that focuses immensely on using its class DC with a bunch of save effects, including, you know, their Nimbus Surge, various abilities they can pick up with feats to have poor class DC. And while I do think that they stand on their own, I think it's something to keep an eye on and maybe touch up for future updates to the playtest or for the full release. That's my overall thoughts on Melee. I think if I had to put it all in one spot, this would be the place. Melee is fine. You're able to control places and get good damage in. It's just that there's something lost by being the only person in Melee, and particularly because enemies don't seem to be pressured as much by being in melee with them as I would expect them to. They tend to step backwards and then shoot, or if you have a reach weapon, you might be able to attack of opportunity them once, but then, or reactive strike them once, but then they will just begin to run away and use their minions, etc. Solid enough to work, but I think there is some improvement to be done. Next up is the Soldier. Soldier is another Constitution key class. Oh, sorry, the Solarian is a Strength key class. That is, my apologies, I misspoke earlier. The Soldier is a Constitution key class with 10 hit points. And they focus a lot on being big, being tanky, and using the new Area Fire ability. They have the ability to suppress enemies with their area fire, target enemies within their area fires to follow up with strikes to do even more damage to one person, and then they have subclasses that kind of specialize them into certain parts of that build idea. Soldier also has the best class DC in the playtest, only closely matched by Witchwarper, who matches up until level 18, and then at level 19 the Soldier gets legendary in class DC, where the Witchwarper does not. I think that the Soldier is ultimately an incredibly interesting class. I like how they function, but they're going to live or die by how Area Fire and Auto Fire function, and I have some concerns about those actions. Some very nice people have already done large write-ups on the function of these abilities and how they can be exploited or otherwise unfun to use. My biggest issue is that I think that the auto-fire actions should be targeted. You choose people within an area to shoot, and the area fire should hit everything within it, instead of both of them hitting everything within it. Also, notably, something that was just interesting and kind of strange to see was Soldier getting Fearsome Bulwark at 3rd level. Their Constitution modifier can substitute in for intimidation checks, athletics checks, to reposition or shove. Having something so key to a class at 3rd level just feels very strange, because you can be really, really bad at scaring people and really, really bad at moving people until 3rd level, where you suddenly get a bonus of +4 off of whatever your statistic was before, sometimes less. As far as the Soldier goes, I think it's also a very solid class. It's got the hit points to keep itself up. The fact that it gets to base its main ability, the Area Fire, off of its Constitution modifier, and it has that good scaling, is very, very solid. Although having these early game kind of match progression through level 6, and only at level 7 does Soldier actually get to be unique with their class DC and their Area Fire capability, beyond what things like the Suppressing Fire and Primary Target do, is a little strange. I don't think it's necessarily unfair. Suppressing Fire and Primary Target are very solidly Soldier exclusive abilities, but it's something that just pops out to me. Soldier has a very appealing fantasy, and I think it carries it out very, very well. I'll touch more on the Area Fire and Auto Fire actions when I get down to the equipment section. And then next up, and finally in the class section, is the Witchwarper. This is the intelligence-based caster of the Starfinder 2e playtest. They utilize a unique action called their quantum field, or, well, rather, warp reality, which manifests their quantum field. And this is an area of effect that they can conjure and sustain, and then apply modifiers to. And they have various ways, including their focus spells and their signature spells, there we go, at 3rd level, that allow them to sustain that field as well. Witchwarper is a very good example of something that is very unique and very interesting and very potent. I really like how they managed to balance keeping the warp reality strong enough that it feels like a genuine contender for your turns and your feats. It provides them with an interesting suite of feats, and puts a lot of thought, makes you put a lot of thought into your turns and your actions, alongside a full suite of spellcasting. It's something that I think is very, very fun, and my biggest issue is, thus far, just that the anchor that you choose is not particularly impactful on your class, because of how small a part it plays in what you are able to do. Your anchor benefit is very interesting, but the anchoring action tends to be a little here or there, hit or miss. In particular, this has already been talked about, but Restorative Collection does not work against the stun value, because you cannot act while you are stunned. Overall, though, I think that the Witchwarper is able to carve out solid, unique playstyles purely between its different subclasses and quantum field effects combined with their warp spells. For instance, Anomaly, this was my favorite one to check out and test. It has the initial warp spell of Warp Terrain, which is a focus spell that you can use to cause your quantum field to become difficult terrain for enemies and allow your team to take cover in it, regardless of where you are within it. I think the only thing that I would really want from a Witchwarper right now is some way to more reliably use and move, in particular, their quantum field from the beginning of the game, because it feels like it is currently kind of weighted towards keeping your field near you, where a lot of the features that it has incentivize you to use it away from you. You can always be spending those actions dedicated to sustaining it, but being able to compress that in with other actions is a lot of the fun, particularly with guns and Witchwarper's high class DC as well, allowing them to use grenades quite potently. I feel like Witchwarper, as it is currently, is meant to kind of switch back and forth between using their quantum field and guns and then casting a spell on certain turns and in certain situations. And that's fine, but not quite where I want it to be, particularly in regards to being able to use things at a farther range. Warp Reality, if simply it could lose the requirement of your quantum field isn't active, I think would function quite well. Because then you could just use an action to move your field. It would lose all of its additional effects, but you could then re-add them with anchoring abilities, and that would allow you to kind of treat your Warp Reality and your quantum field as its own spell. Whereas right now it feels like it's almost its own spell that you always have access to. Now, getting on to some more wider topics. Spellcasting in the future. This is just generally a discussion of how they've created spellcasters in the Starfinder 2nd edition system. They seem to have settled on making the spellcasters have 8 hit points, training in light armor, and a suite of 4 spells at each rank in a signature casting style. I'm fine with all of this. I've always enjoyed casting diversity, but I'm not going to turn down these choices because they function plenty well. But I want to focus specifically on, I think the Starfinder team has done immensely well on making these spellcasters feel unique and feel fun. A lot of people I've heard, and these are feelings that I can empathize with, feel that the Pathfinder 2nd edition classes, the spellcasting classes, are a little homogenous because most of what differentiates them in a lot of situations is simply their spell lists. A druid and a wizard are both just casting spells. That's not exactly accurate, of course. There are focus spells, increased amounts of spells for the wizard. The wizard has a thesis. But I think it kind of strikes at the core of something that is a valid criticism and something that people might want, something that I want from casters, even as someone who loves them in their current state. And that is, I want casters that feel particularly unique. I want casters that have actions that compete with or supplement their spells, that only they have access to. And I think that the Starfinder 2nd edition playtest has done this extraordinarily well. Mystic having the ability to build up and maintain this vitality network and use a single action to heal their allies, and then that combining in with their connections to give them bonus abilities. So, for example, Akashic, whenever you heal someone, they also get to recall knowledge. Or, for example, rhythm. Whenever you heal someone, you can sustain your active epiphanies, so your anthem, for example. Or you can even cast a one-action focus spell as part of the action. So you could cast your anthem as you heal someone. This is an incredibly good example of kind of supplementing your spell casting. This is very similar, I feel, to how the Bard does it. And in particular, what I really like is the fact that casters are getting things other than focus spells to differentiate them. Focus spells are fine. I do like them. But when all that separates a class from a different one is focus spells, it feels like these are these kind of abilities that you can go to a few times and then you're just a caster. Whereas with the Mystic here, for example, being able to heal someone and get bonus effects and have those focus spells, and particularly as well, I just want a little tangent, I like how they have given the focus spells for free at certain levels, so there isn't any sort of incentive to take feats. I think that's an incredibly good choice, particularly because now, when they have these unique features that they can consistently rely on, so your transfer vitality, the feats can be based around those. Another complaint that I've seen that I do think I actually agree with is that spellcasters struggle to have interesting feats in Pathfinder 2nd Edition, and I think Starfinder has really, really knocked it out of the park with the infrastructure on their casters, allowing casters to do something only they can do, and then have feats that extend upon that. Using Network Spell to be able to treat your allies as the origin points for your spells, using Cloud Storage to be able to store items using your Vitality Network. And then we still do have things like Eldritch Bond here, where you can pick up some additional focus spells that are nice, thematic, and fun if you want them. Is incredibly, incredibly interesting. I think that this is an amazing example, and something I really want to see more of in the playtest going forward and into the main game, is casters that focus on these unique abilities. And then, so the Mystic is a good example of supplementary abilities, and I wanted to talk a little bit about Witchwarper as well, because I think they, as I touched on a little bit before, are an immensely good example of abilities that compete with your spells, even. Being able to warp reality and conjure this AoE within range that then has various effects. So, you know, the Analyst being able to seek or recall knowledge against multiple things in your quantum field anomaly, being able to disrupt concentrate actions within it. And then as you get into the feats, again, they get amazing feat choices, very interesting and unique things that make me want to play the class for more than just its spell list. Things like Anchoring Strike, where you can shoot your gun, and if you hit, you can sustain your field. Or even things like Debris Zone, where you switch your field to be difficult terrain. These are immensely awesome feats and features that make me want to play a Witchwarper that isn't just casting a spell every turn. Sometimes they're conjuring their field and then trying to buff it up and sustain it, and they're running around while doing that, taking advantage of grenades with their high class DC, etc. It conjures a lot of extremely fun and imaginative concepts in my mind, and I think I just have to triple down on saying it. I think that spellcasting has been absolutely knocked out of the park by the Starfinder team in this playtest. I want to see more of what we have here, and I'm looking forward to it. Now, for something a little less fun and a little less complimentary, I want to get into some concerns that I have about a dexterity meta in Starfinder. I touched on this in my combat demonstration video. If you haven't seen that, feel free to go ahead and check it out. I'll link it down below. But the TLDR of it is that as it stands in the current game, because dexterity is a bonus to your armor class and functions for guns, basically every single class that isn't going to be built to go into melee, so that would be some soldiers, some operatives, and Solarians, is going to have dexterity as either their primary or their secondary stat. It's almost mandatory. At least that's how it feels. For example, a Witchwarper and a Mystic both feel like you're supposed to maximize your casting stat and then maximize dexterity, so you get hit less and you can hit things with your guns. Everyone has guns, everyone wants guns, unless they have something incentivizing them to do something else in particular. When I look at the Mystic Iconic, for example, here, the I believe their name is Chick Chick. They have a melee weapon, and that is very striking. It looks very cool, but I'm left wondering how this would work in the game, because to get a melee weapon up to relative potency, you would likely want it to be your secondary statistic. So it'd be a +4 to wisdom, a +3 to strength, and then a +1, or if you have a flaw somewhere that is giving you an additional +1 at your ancestry step, a +2 to dexterity, means that your armor class is going to be 2 points behind where it would be if you had boosted dexterity instead. 1 or 2 points. And as well as that, you won't be able to use guns. Little less of an issue, since you will have a melee weapon to make up for that. But of note in particular, though, is that without the tools to close gaps and maintain yourself when you are in melee as well, it just seems like there's very little incentive to get into melee to boost anything other than dexterity unless your class is built around it specifically. That's a concern that I have. I'm not sure how it could be addressed, perhaps with different armor features, or by benefiting strength in some way outside of purely melee weapons, maybe making the melee weapons themselves stronger. I have not been able to piece together exactly what to do. I understand that it's a very difficult issue, and I will also say I do feel pretty firmly that while Starfinder 2nd Edition, the playtest thus far, has a dexterity meta, I also think that Pathfinder has a strength meta, where if you can afford to get yourself into even medium armor, you will want to maximize your strength over your dexterity, usually, because it can keep you in melee combat more often. And then, you know, with your casters, you might take up dexterity, or with dexterity-based classes, in particular things like rogue or investigator or swashbuckler. But just like in Starfinder, where I struggle to see a major incentive to build for strength without a class feature incentivizing you to, I think it's very much the same for Pathfinder as well. Without a feature incentivizing dexterity, or the lack of incentive to do strength, you're kind of pushed into strength. So it's kind of a double-edged sword. I don't think it's necessarily an issue, but I do think it is something to keep an eye on in particular. That's going to close out the class specifics, so that's kind of more about characters in particular and how they play. Next up is equipment. There are various things I wanted to touch on here. A lot of them are very simple. I'm going to be going to the weapons section, the ranged weapons section, for most of this, because guns are very good examples for a lot of the features that I want to talk about here. First up is Tech versus Analogue, and a little side note for the glitching condition, which I'll get into more at the very end. As is, I am having a little bit of difficulty kind of being able to weigh tech weapons versus analog weapons, or even tech equipment in general that doesn't provide a particular unique feature like a comm unit, for example. If we were to look at the martial ranged weapons here, for example, the machine gun has 20 projectiles, an expend of 1. Even though it does require 2 actions to reload, that's 20 shots before you do. It has the automatic trait, 40-foot range, and it's a D8 of piercing damage. And then if we go right beneath it here, the plasma caster is a D8 of fire damage with a range of 60 feet, a reload of 1, and 10 charges, but it expends 2 per shot, and then it has boost 1, which allows you to, gonna double check myself here before I say it, just to be sure that I'm not gonna have to correct myself. Yes, you interact by spending an expend, and then it does bonus listed damage for each weapon die. Alrighty. Perfect. I want to be sure that I understood exactly how that worked. And so the plasma caster here has essentially 5 shots, as opposed to the 20 of the machine gun. It does fire damage, which can bypass things like physical resistance, but can also be hit by things like fire resistance, which isn't uncommon. It gets a little bit more range, and then it has the ability to boost its damage with an additional action and even more ammo. This is definitely a niche that I think functions, but, and this is where I want to get into the glitching condition, tech weapons have some issues. It's currently unclear exactly how batteries function. If you can, say, charge partially, so like if a machine gun, if your magazine has 19 bullets in it, you can take the magazine out, load a bullet into it, and then put it back in, and it's at 20 bullets again. This would be in between combats, to be clear. Whereas with a plasma caster, it's unclear whether or not you could pull out your battery with, let's say, 3 charges expended, charge up those 3, and then put it back in, or if you would need to take that out, put a new one in, and just go with it. And you'd need to wait until you came to some sort of recharging station like they had in Starfinder First Edition to recharge it, or if you're just stuck with those kind of partially expended magazines. That's the first pain point. It's a small one. But then, particularly, tech weapons don't seem to be immensely stronger. And in fact have a lot of unique weaknesses. So the plasma caster is a good weapon, but we'll go into the rotolaser here because it's a little more comparable to the machine gun. It's a D8 of fire damage with a 30-foot range, a little shorter. Reload of the same, reload of 1, so half. 3 bulk, so it is very heavy. You will need to be very strong to be able to wield this. 2 hands, 10 charges, 1 expend, and then it has basically the same traits, except switching out analog for tech. They're both automatic, and then analog or tech. And in this situation, I'm left wondering why you would choose the rotolaser over the machine gun, because the machine gun is not susceptible to the glitching condition. And the glitching condition, for those who don't know, when an item or a person with the tech trait becomes glitching, then if it's a person at the start of your turn, you make a DC 10 plus the value of the glitching condition flat check, and you suffer some kind of penalty. If it's an item in this case, so your rotolaser, you make that flat check whenever you try to use the item. And if you fail the flat check, you can't use the item. So if your rotolaser were to become glitching 1, there would be a 50% chance every time you use the roto laser with an action, so a strike, a reload, whatever, that it doesn't work. And that's not... I struggle to see why I would not take the ease of use and reliability of Analogue over the seeming lack of benefit that tech actually provides me. Because fire damage is not so immensely better than physical that I want to take it for that, and the other benefits seem not quite worth it. So I think that that's something that needs to be touched up, maybe considered a little more, see what tech can do that Analogue can't. I don't necessarily think that Analogue weapons should be weaker. I think that they might actually be fine. It's just that I think tech has some issues. And another thing to go into is specifically with the armors. Tech armor has, every single one of them has the tech trait. All of the armors have the tech trait, which means that they have built-in comm units, which is very nice. But it's unclear what should happen if your armor is glitching. If you are caught in an AoE that makes items glitching and your armor becomes glitching, does it count as you being glitching and you need to make the flat check to avoid penalties? Or is any action that causes you to move, so like a stride, would that invoke a flat check as your armor isn't responding to you? That's unclear and should use some guidance. I'll get some more into the glitching condition at the end. Also, while we're on the tech discussion, there's things that I want to talk about for new avenues, specifically flight and information. I think that it's very well handled, the different access thresholds for things that in Pathfinder are more difficult to get to. For example, in Starfinder 2nd edition here, you can get a jetpack. I'm not sure if it's in the adventuring gear or somewhere else. I can just search for it. You can get a jetpack, which gives you some flying speed. There we go. Very early. You can just install it into some armor, and it allows you to fly slowly with an action, and you're off guard when you hover in place. And then there are similar things like jump jets that allow you to fly short distances. I think that the jetpack and flight access options are going to feel great and be very interesting in the Starfinder playtest. I showed that off a little bit in my combat demonstration the other day, as the sniper was able to use a jetpack even at a relatively low level to get on top of cargo containers. I think it's going to add a lot of versatility in height in the game, as well as, of course, enabling zero gravity. And then secondarily, another thing to get used to of the new avenues is information. This is particularly what I wanted to look at here with the adventuring gear. The comm unit is a minor portable computer and cellular communications device that allows instantaneous wireless communication with other comm units in audio and text-based formats at a planetary range. It also includes a calculator, a flashlight, a browser that accesses any local infospheres, and several entertainment options, including games. And a reminder that all of this is built into every single set of armor in the playtest, because the comm unit has all of those. These are incredibly interesting storytelling differences from Pathfinder. In Pathfinder, you need to see a flyer or speak to someone to learn some information. In Starfinder, people can just find it. They can hear it over the radio, they can see it on the infosphere, etc. The only thing that I am hoping for is that we have some clear rules and interactions on how using infospheres works, as I found it kind of clumsy in the playtest module that is on Foundry Virtual Tabletop, Cosmic Birthday. It tells you that the party learns some things, they hear some things over the infosphere or find things, and it can feel kind of strange to just like interject and say, by the way, while you were walking, you found this on the infosphere, or this kind of alert went out across the infosphere, or this was on the radio. And so having some maybe clearer rules for that, and especially rules for how players can communicate with one another. Like, can they communicate with each other simply by interacting and like, oh, here's my comm number, and then they can communicate at a planetary range no matter what? That's a question that I have, and something that I would like to see addressed in particular with rules. I don't think that these are issues. These are things that I like, but are going to take adjustment and some further rules clarifications, I think. Next up, I want to touch on something I've seen discussed, the non-magical issue. This is what I'm dubbing it. This is particularly just in reference to the fact that weapons are not magical, and upgrading them does not make them magical. And so things like resistance to non-magical weaponry is not going to be very compatible across games. Because if you see here under the weapon improvements, the damage dice is just a listed number, and then tracking, if we go into the weapon traits here, because I believe it's contained under the traits, tech, thought, throne, tracking, yes, here we go. It just gives an item bonus to your attack rolls and increases the DC for aerial weapons. It does not have any mention of becoming magical, and so that's a valid concern as far as compatibility goes between the games. And then finally, this is something that I wanted to touch on, particularly because we're in a far future setting and there's a bunch of new stuff. Some clarifications on adventuring gear would be good. This is exactly what I was talking about with the comm unit, but it also applies to a lot of the other items in here. Things like, trying to come up with a good example off the top of my head here. Comm unit and yes, for example, like locks. There are a few circumstances in the playtest where, for example, things, or the playtest module, where things can become locked, but electronically, and it's not exactly evident how that interacts with things like hacking. It's fairly intuitive to make out, but it would be nicer to have more specific rules on things like that and how you can set them up in particular. Generally, just some more understandable uses of things, in particular as well, apps. I think we might be getting rules about those in the future, and how they interact. So just some clear rules on some equipment. My apologies on struggling to come up with perfect examples. Finally, I want to touch on the overall infrastructure of the playtest thus far, and I want to lead off with the kind of more in-depth talk about compatible versus balanced. As I said before, the Starfinder team has said what many people, myself included, read as contradictory statements in the past, some saying that the system should be compatible but won't necessarily be balanced with each other. And now in the playtest where they're saying that the classes should be able to play side by side, it can make it feel like they want it to be balanced against each other in addition to being compatible. I'm of the opinion, personally, that Starfinder is going to be a better game if it's its own game. I think that the compatibility is nice. I think that things should function in the other game when you port them over. You know, you take a monster stat block and it plays. But I don't necessarily think that Starfinder will be a better game if it tries to maintain balance with Pathfinder. I'm fine with Starfinder classes and Starfinder monsters being stronger in certain respects, and perhaps even respects that will end up causing balance issues if you just toss them in across systems willy-nilly. I think that that provides more flexibility in the design of the game overall in a way that is going to make Starfinder a better game. And so that's where I stand on it personally. I think that Starfinder should strive to be compatible, but should not put as much effort into balance. Particularly, it shouldn't try to make it balanced if it'll be to the detriment of Starfinder itself and its own content. Next up, I wanted to touch on just kind of a recap on skills and more guidance on how to use them. When we go into the skills section here, we have the new skills, Computers and Piloting, where it talks about accessing the infosphere and recalling knowledge. And it has these actions along with hack and program, and then driving, navigating, plotting a course, etc., etc. These are interesting, but I feel like skills need a little bit more guidance here. So, for example, Access Infosphere is talking specifically about accessing a computer to gain information as an exploration activity. Hacking is talking specifically about essentially just picking a lock, but for computer systems. And I would like more guidance on how these skills, or even not these skills, but just things that are similar to them, can be used in general. This is essentially the comm unit question again. Can players who have just met up already immediately interface with each other at infinite distances, planetary distances, because they have each other's communication numbers, things like that. I want more clarification on what can and can't be used. For example, while I was running the Cosmic Birthday playtest, I allowed a player to use the hack activity to try to reprogram a robot so that it wouldn't be in their way, because I wanted it to not be as much of kind of like a rolling through all of the enemies experience at the end of that there. But there was very little guidance on how that worked. I ended up doing victory points with the hack activity. Next up is touching on Area Fire. I think Area Fire is almost perfect. I think that it's an amazing way to tie in the ability for players to do things like mow down enemies with an automatic rifle, or to shoot or throw grenades at enemies. But the biggest issue is that the rules are a little bit rough currently. They're attack actions, but they don't interact with the multiple attack penalty at all, which is, well, that's not fair to say. They don't interact with the multiple attack penalty in themselves, which is interesting. Things like auto fire just hits each creature in the area instead of targeted creatures in the area. So it's like you're doing a full sweep across, but then you only expend ammo for how many creatures there are. You'll hit invisible creatures with your auto fire, and lose ammo for doing so. It creates these, I fail to come up with a better word than perverse incentives to use things like auto fire to clear rooms, and being able to use these actions without needing to be trained in the weapon also means that there are some issues. I want to touch on as well, bring this back over here. The blue is better. The darker the gray, the worse. This represents the number that an average on-level enemy will have to roll to succeed against your area fire and thus take half damage, just for a quick summary there. But as you can see with area fire, the DCs on a lot of these classes are scaling in kind of steps. Envoy doesn't get Expert until level 9. Operative doesn't get it until level 11, and Solarian doesn't get it until level 13. Mystic never progresses past Trained. I think that this is very interesting. I'm glad they're experimenting with it. I'm not against it, but I do think it could use some touch-ups, as I talked about before with Solarian. They're not good at using grenades because they don't get their Expert class DC until level 13, but that also means that their actual class features are weaker. And I think that that's a missed opportunity and something that I think should be looked at a little more. And I've heard as well that Mystic has this non-scaling class DC because they weren't able to use grenades at all in Starfinder 1. So I think that that's interesting. I'm not sure whether that would be amazing game design. I think I'm for it. Conceptually, and in practice I have not had any issues yet, but I also have yet to do some of the higher level, like the top 5 experiments, so we'll see where I am with that. I think this is interesting. I'm glad they're experimenting with these different scalars of class DCs, but I have these concerns about area fire. It's almost there. I love it a lot, especially with grenades and how you can one-action area fire with them. I think it's a great system. I love that they've kind of baked this concept that's kind of core to sci-fi and like using guns and grenades into a basic action. Next up is wording and why that's fine. This is specifically just to cover a lot of various things where wording is unclear or perhaps even contradictory across the playtest. And the why that's fine is because the intent is usually very clear and it's a playtest. I wasn't expecting perfect wording on everything that was put out, and I think it's important to specifically take this opportunity to point out that the people working on this are real humans, just like the rest of us. They have their flaws. They get tired. They are probably putting in immense amounts of love and effort and time into this. And I'm really, really glad for what they've put out. And I think that for every issue that I can critique in this playtest, there are a dozen things that I love. Like even with area fire, I tried to make it clear there, like even though it has these issues where you can kind of abuse auto fire and it feels strange and it has these issues with proficiency, I think that it's an amazing way to implement this into the game. It adds a whole slew of opportunities for writing and general infrastructure for the game, and I think it's very good. Next up, I wanted to touch on gravity, radiation, and environments. This is just a rough kind of thoughts on something. They're contained under the deities section in the PDF at the very bottom here. They have environments, and leading off with gravity. The gravity wording is a little strange, and the rules surrounding it are also kind of strange. Normal gravity just has no effect, it's normal. High gravity makes you and your gear weigh twice as much. You move at half speed, you can only jump half as far, and you can only lift or carry half as much, which combined with the fact that your gear weighs twice as much means everything is going to be 4 times heavier. And it also reduces the range of thrown weapons. But then there's this sidebar here saying that if your character's homeworld has unusually high gravity, then you cannot suffer penalties while exploring such an environment. It doesn't provide any sort of rules for how to take advantage of this. And so this would just be, if you can get your GM to allow you to opt into it, you will be stronger because you won't be suffering downsides in high gravity. And then when I go to low gravity here, it says that you can jump twice as far, can lift or carry twice your normal amount, and it doubles the range of thrown weapons. Specifically, it lets you carry twice as many things, but your items don't weigh twice as much like weigh half as much like high gravity does for twice. It's just this weird kind of disparity. I feel like high gravity should not have your gear weighing twice as much. And then extreme gravity is high gravity but with damage, and zero gravity has its own unique features, being able to carry a lot, throw things very far, and then you float around unless you have a method of propelling yourself. Some people have already touched on specific wording issues with propulsion, where, for example, if you were in a zero gravity, zero atmosphere environment, wings would not be able to move you, but rules as written, they currently can. Whereas if you were in a zero gravity yes environment way, or oh my goodness, atmosphere, a zero gravity environment with an atmosphere, then wings could, and so wording could change a little bit there to kind of match methods of propulsion, but that's fine. Next up is radiation sickness. This is very interesting. It's referenced in a few features and spells, and what's particularly interesting to me, and I don't have the examples ready currently, but there's a spell called Irradiate that produces the effects of radiation sickness using your class DC for the saving throw, and then I believe there's a grenade. It's an item or a spell or something else that just exposes a creature to normal radiation without it replacing the DC, which makes it actually extremely non-functional. I think that radiation sickness is a good idea, but it also has this odd progression where the damage starts off very small, it increments a little bit, increments a tiny bit, and then increments an immense amount at level 15. When you go to the incredible radiation sickness, it's, instead of this kind of gradual progression, it feels like it goes from here to quite a lot more to a little bit more to a lot more. That's something that could be touched on, I think, a little bit, but I do like the radiation being here. And then finally, it talks about other various environments like acid rain, gravity wells, Psystorm, vortex, and it talks about some more things like airlocks and automatic doors. I really like all of this. I think that these would be immensely interesting things to get various rules for in a GM core equivalent for Starfinder, being able to reference, oh, I want an airlock here, how should that work? And then being able to look at it and see, oh, well, they work like this. And I think it would be interesting to have these be rules-based in addition to just flavorful, the same way that, for example, acid rain is up here in the natural effects. Finally, I want to close out my discussion here with a talk about conditions. There are only 3 of them. The glitching condition I'm going to save for last because I want to end on something big. Suppressed, I think, is a very interesting condition. I wish there were more ways to apply it, actually, personally. Maybe have something like if someone shoots the cover that you're hiding behind, you become suppressed. As is currently, it feels like Soldier is the only one that can regularly access suppress. But I quite like how it functions, making people move slower and take penalties to attack rolls. I think that that's just very flavorful, very useful. It's a good debuffing tool. Untethered makes it so that you can't take move actions unless you can use them in your current environment, unless it specifies that. And then at the end of your turn, you move in a certain direction, the last direction that you moved. You float kind of in that way. And then you typically also are clumsy and off guard because you're in 0G. And then it gives you a unique action. Well, there is a unique action called push off that lets you move, push against something and move away from it. And something that I found very interesting about push off was that it lets you float up to half your speed in a chosen direction. And you can use it as part of striking or shoving an enemy. But then the enemy won't move at all if what you used was a strike, and will only move 5 feet around if you shove them, because they will remain just simply untethered. I think the 0G rules are going to be a pain to run, but that's just how it is in 3 dimensions when playing a pen and paper game. I can't blame the designers for that, and I think that what they have created here is going to work very well and be very funny, if nothing else. But finally, I want to touch on glitching. I do not like how glitching is currently implemented. I think it's too variable, and that's both in application and effect. Glitching applies to creatures or objects, and it applies differently to each of them. If a creature has the glitching condition, they make a flat check at the beginning of each round. The DC is always going to be 10 plus your glitching value. And then on a success, you act as normal for the turn. On a failure, you take a penalty to an item penalty to all your checks and DCs equal to your glitching value. On a critical failure, you become stunned 1 for the round, which I interpret because it's at the beginning of the round, you don't lose your actions for it. And then a critical success reduces your glitching value by 1. Whereas if there's equipment that's glitching, rather than making a flat check at the start of your turn, you make the flat check every time you try to use an action, and then it uses the same degrees of success here. Reduce the effect, do nothing, item penalty, or stunned 1. And notably here again, if you critically fail while using a weapon, you lose the action that you attempted to use. I don't like how cumbersome it is in actual play, particularly having to track, oh, my gun has glitching, my armor has glitching, my other gun has glitching, and then someone uses another effect, and suddenly one of my guns is glitching 2, one of my guns is glitching 1, my armor is only glitching 1, and then my armor, I'm not sure what effect that's supposed to have. My proposed rework that I've just kind of workshopped and thought about for glitching is that glitching is a condition that can affect someone who has any tech gear on them. So even if it's as simple as a comm unit in your backpack, you can become glitching. And then while you are glitching, some kind of effect. I'm not entirely against the flat check here, but I've found that it slows down gameplay, and particularly having half of the flat check effects do nothing, and half of them be, well, various levels of debilitating, from decently to immensely, just leads to glitching feeling too inconsistent to use as a player, and immensely frustrating to deal with if you are a player. If you become glitching, there's a chance you just lose actions, or you lose penalties, but if you inflict glitching on an enemy, there's a chance that just nothing happens. And then again, the bookkeeping of having to track all these different possible states of glitching, what is and isn't, what you've used, I think it would be better as a condition just applied to anyone, because then you could still build out of it if you use, I'm not sure if they'll have analog armor, but if they have that, you could build a character theoretically who is all analog and thus immune to glitching, but it would have to be a concerted choice. You'd have to avoid all of these options, and I think that would be interesting and unique, and I think that would really lend to the idea. As is, I see glitching as a thematically satisfying effect, where, for example, I try to shoot my gun and it doesn't work and I have to hit it and it wastes a few seconds and then I can shoot it. But it's too frustrating in the game to stick around for now. My overall thoughts of the playtest, after the hours and hours of testing that I've done and running games, I am a huge fan of what they put together. There are a lot of small things adding up that I would like to see addressed and changed as the playtest moves forward, but I think that the infrastructure that they've set down, and particularly what they've done with all 6 classes that we've been given access to, is immensely well crafted. I love what they've built. I think that they have managed to make ranged weapons and a ranged meta feel good, even without flat damage bonuses, even without relying on an Envoy to stack everyone up, or being an Operative to give yourself some damage bonuses. They've made guns feel good. They've made a mobile meta where people are moving around to and between cover and benefiting each other through that. I think it's immensely impressive and immensely enjoyable. The biggest thing that I want beyond those small little adjustments is just more. I want more rules, more clarifications, and I know it's a little demanding. I want more Starfinder. It's incredible what they put together. I'm very happy to be here, to be a part of this playtest, and to be making videos talking about it for all of you. I'm going to bring my little chart up here for anyone who would like to be able to reference it themselves. This is an average to hit chart that I compiled. The average armor class of an on-level enemy is listed up here from levels 1 through 20, so it'll be on your same level. These will be the numbers that you have to roll to hit an enemy. And then I have the average over on the right. And then at the bottom here, I have the average reflex bonus for a creature of the same level. And then the average roll that the creature has to roll on the die to succeed their saving throw. So a level 1 creature against a soldier's area fire at the same level. The creature only needs to roll a 10 on the die to succeed on average. And there's the averages again on the right there. This is a decent starting point. By no means take this as, a replacement for proper critical thinking and real experience in the game. It's a tool to be used, as any math sheet is for a TTRPG, and always consider the fact as well that TTRPGs are constantly changing and adapting as you play with your fellow players and your game master. But yeah, that's all for me. I love the Starfinder playtest. I'm looking forward to making more about it. I'm working on something both smaller and big at the same time, a little bit more highly edited. I'm looking forward to releasing it in the coming days here. Maybe it'll come out before this, who knows. But I will see you all next time. Please leave a like if you liked the video. Subscribe if you want to see more. Helps out a lot. I'll see you all next time. See ya. See ya.